evening. Welcome to the Blanc Township Board of Trustees meeting of the Committee of the Whole. And Mr. Atkins, would you lead us in the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good evening, and we'd like to see if we can get an approval of the agenda for tonight's meeting.
So moved.
Support.
Okay, any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? With that, we will open the floor for public comment. And Mr. Ert, good evening.
Good evening, Ed, 7212 Porter Road. I'm going to hold my comments until after the election. That way,
Thank you.
you're welcome. But after that happens, I will have plenty of comments.
Okay.
And also, I was hoping Mr. Rushing would be here this evening. I was going to try to give him a few words of my own at the podium. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ert. With that, any other public comment? Seeing none, we will move to review the Township Board agenda for a meeting on Thursday, July 12th. And we want to turn to that agenda. We will have basically our approval of the minutes. Our consent agenda has a number of items, approval of the treasurer's report. If there's anything in there, Mr. Mansur?
So I have a couple of questions on the treasurer's report. First of all, I'd like to just, kind of look through this every week, but are there any items that are forecast to exceed the budget as we know them on there, either expense or revenue related?
Not currently. In fact, the budget to actuals I went through, there's some slight variations in just in individual line items, but everything is below where it should be, below 50% as a cost center.
And one more question. On page 25, there's a item that's called a contingent budget. I think it's in the GIS department for $25,000. And then there are a couple of other line items that also say contingent on them. What is that?
Give Mr. Lehman a chance to put it up.
On page 25 of the budget to actual report.
Of the board packet, so it would be probably a few pages. I think it had to do with the GIS expenditures, the IT GIS.
Is it that new system?
No, it appears, contingent expense appears in a couple of different areas.
So in where it says like contingent employee wages.
Yeah, to like $25,000?
Yeah, 24,000.
Yep.
So we have had the board approved in the budget last year a part-time person for the GIS IT department to assist in the transition to the on-base document management thing. So it's called contingent because they're a contingent employee.
Okay.
Part-time, basically part-time employee.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. Next item on the consent agenda is the motion to accept the recommendation of Clerk Lane to appoint Lynn Henry as Deputy Clerk effective July 25th, 2018, with the retirement of Deputy Clerk Susan DeVerney on August 10th.
So did we conclude the compensation negotiations within the parameters that?
Yes.
Okay.
So, Mr. Chair,
Yes.
effective July the 25th, is that the starting date?
Yes. That is, she put in her official notice last night of her resignation, but that's the soonest she can get here because of completing things where she works.
What day is that, July the 25th?
I think it's a Wednesday.
A Wednesday? Okay. So that's, I assume that you took care of that as adequate amount of time prior to the election?
I we're doing the best we can. She had to complete things where she's working to make sure that they had a smooth election transition. And between her and Sue and myself, we will deal with the shorter time frame because she wants to be, you know, a professional where she's leaving, so.
So I understand your answer to be, there may be some flaws, but we will work and do our best.
We absolutely will.
Okay. Next item, item C, the board will consider a motion to award the DPW two-way radio system replacement project to Synergy Products of Troy, Michigan for $26,741.02 and authorize township superintendent to execute all related contracts and documents. Mr. Lehman, any comment?
Director Sears is here, can answer any questions, but we did use the
State bid
State
system.
of Michigan bids, and while I think it was 17 people looked at, it went out to 71 people, 17 looked at it. The bids were 2.
Correct. Unfortunately, we didn't get a very good bid turnout on this. We have been using BidNet, which is a statewide and national-wide bidding system for municipalities. I think I put some details in the memo about, we had 71 vendors actually looked, or we reached out to actually 71 vendors. Very few actually downloaded the documents, and I only got 2 bids back. After I got bids back, I did reach out to some other local vendors, and they weren't interested in the work. So it's kind of strange, but I know the one vendor, Bloomricks, who's local here in Flint, they're doing all the 911 work right now, so they have all the work they can handle, but this is all I could solicit at this time. I did work with this company previously, and I had this radio system in previous positions, and it's a good system, it's a good company, their service is very good, and I'm confident they can deliver a very good product to us.
So, Mr. Sears, for the radio system, it's for communication amongst your crew.
For our DPW technicians, mostly when they're plowing snow, but they do use it throughout the summer months. As you know, it's illegal now to use cell phones while you're driving at all. So the safest way for them to communicate, which is constant during plowing, is through two-way radios. The system we have right now is an old public safety system, and we're using an old public safety frequency and equipment, and it has a lot of backfeed on it, a lot of interference, to the point where sometimes they can go an hour without being able to talk to each other. I can't communicate with them without calling them, which I don't like to do, or physically going and finding them. So this is really the best and safest thing for our crew, so we can have effective communication with them, and they can communicate with each other, and they can communicate back with us during these operations.
Question? Mr. Mansour?
How old is the current system?
Oh, gosh. The repeater we have is fairly new. I bought that since I've been here. But it's on the old frequency. I wish Ron was here because he could tell you. It's old VHF public safety system before they went on 800 megahertz. So it's at least 15 years old, I would say. And I think that's at least. I think it's much older than that. We're using old equipment up on our water tower back here. That's at least 25 years old, I would say. A key point, though, the antenna that actually comes with the system is made by Laird Technologies. I was talking to Scott about that. I thought that was kind of neat to see that, considering Laird just opened up here in the township.
Right.
So.
Yeah.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Mr. Massey.
A question to the director. Is it required for the workers to keep their radio on at all times, or how does that work?
Their radios will be in their trucks, so they're mobile radios that are mounted in the trucks. We are purchasing a few portable radios with headsets, so that when they're cleaning sewer along the really loud machines, they can still communicate with each other. But otherwise, the radios will be right in the truck, so that mostly when they're going to talk to us, they'll be in their vehicles.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Okay, no other questions. Move on to operational issues. And the board will consider a resolution to add 6 streetlights to our contract with Consumers Energy. These lights will be located on Topaz Circle in Gemstone Valley. The township has received payment for the installation from Pulte. And Mr. Lemata?
So this really is a lighting district. As you guys know, we have lighting districts throughout the township by neighborhood. What happens when they make these requests is they come through and they want to add street lights. They give us the check to add the street lights. So they're paying for the installation. And then the electricity that it takes, or the power that it takes to run the street lights, is also billed to them, and they get charged as part of that special assessment district. So really, it's more of a, well, we manage it. It's really something that is the residents want to have. They ask us for it. They make the petition for the street lights. They pay for the installation. They pay for the juice to run them. We just add it into the special assessment.
Yeah, most people don't realize that on their tax bill, they're paying for the lights in the neighborhood. Mr. Massey?
Mr. Chair, I have a question for the superintendent. Since this issue here is pertaining to this issue, basically, but it's not this issue, I probably should say. You remember when we talked about street lights in certain areas that we were gonna do an investigation and determine which streets should get new lights, such as Emory Road?
Well, we have a contract with consumers that they're replacing many of the streetlights on the main roads with LED. I don't know that they were adding any at that time, but I know we had some discussion that there might be a few places where we'd like one, you know, like.
If we decide that we want, you know, as a board, you guys want to look and add streetlights, we can certainly do that. We pay the installation, we pay the cost to install it, and then, you know, depending on where it's located, then we're going to pay the electricity as well.
Right.
So I mean, as a board, you guys certainly have that ability to add streetlights or add street lighting outside of a special assessment district if you so chose to do so.
I remember Mr. Massey bringing up Embry Road not having any lights, but there's a number of other roads in the township that don't have any lights either, and we start doing it on one. I don't know who determined where the lights are right now. They seem to be at like intersections of, you know, cross streets is where you see a lot of those, but I'm not sure who came up with the original plan for where those lights are on main streets, but they seem to be spaced kind of evenly on intersections. A lot of these, yeah, you look at some of these the cost to put in lights, there's a few residents that called, and I know Mr. Sears researched with consumers, and it's not cheap. You're looking at thousands of dollars to, let's say you wanted to put one on Embry. They're going to run power to that, have to put a pole in, and then you're going to pay the utility, but it's going to be several $1,000s just for one light. So it kind of surprised a few people in a few neighborhoods when they asked for those quotes. Ms. Lane?
Well, Concord Green being one of the earlier subdivisions in the 1960s that didn't have the same requirements that they require now, we went out and had to circulate a special assessment petition, just like we did for the roads. And we had the cost, and we paid for the installation, and so
Right.
old subdivisions petition it just like they would for a road, and newer subdivisions under state law are required to put them in.
Right. Okay. Yes, Mr. Atkins?
Just so I understand this, so is this just a pass-through payment to us, or do we actually contract? Do you have a question for?
Sure.
Does the DPW workers go out and actually do this work, or is it just?
This is 100% consumers. The HOA wrote a check to consumers, and they mailed it to me. And once the resolution's passed, I'll put all the paperwork in a package and send it all to consumers. So they do 100% of the work.
Fine. Thanks.
It is an option down the road if a municipality wanted to purchase the lights from the municipality, from what I understand, but.
Just
we're
not in
looking at
Grand Blanc
that.
Township.
Right. You don't want
But
to
yeah,
be in the lighting business.
that could always happen.
Right.
Sometime after I retire, preferably.
I know the city of Ann Arbor did it. But, it was pretty expensive, but they
A lot
claimed
of-
they saved a lot of money too.
A lot of municipalities do own their own streetlights.
We'll take that up at the next meeting.
No, we did that last year.
Okay, thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Sears. Okay, any other questions on that lighting? Okay, item B, board will consider a motion to approve Planner Mark Lloyd's application packet and associated fee to allow temporary parking on private property in conjunction with the Ally Challenge Golf Tournament from September 13th to September 16th, 2018, and allow staff to begin accepting and processing applications. So we had some information in here, and Mr. Lloyd, if you want to come up? Mr. Lima, do you want to talk about this briefly?
Just for the new board members especially, I mean, it's obviously been 9 years since we've had a golf tournament in Grand Blanc Township, and prior to that, it was handled in a variety of ways. One of them was because it violates our parking ordinances about where you can park cars on lawns and things like that. It used to go through the zoning board of appeals, and folks would have to pay the $450 because we got to pay the ZBA members and schedule it and do everything, and it just seemed to us, as we got ready to kick this thing back off, that it would be smarter to handle it administratively and lessen that burden of running it through the ZBA. So we asked Mark to research it and put some information together, and that's the packet that's before you this evening. And with that, Director Lloyd.
Well, first of all, appreciate the opportunity to stand before you and present this. What I want to do is touch base on just a couple of the highlights, and I'll answer any questions you might have. You've all received the packet, I assume. And I think the one thing to keep in mind is that what we're doing here is really just a very small piece of the overall Ally Challenge event. You know, this is allowing some folks in the area to allow cars to park on their lawns, or businesses to allow cars. There's a couple of places around that are going to want to do that, schools and other facilities. So we need a process to go through and to ensure that that process is solid, and that we also find a way to hold the township harmless from any potential liability. So in there, you'll see there's some requirements, none the least of which is insurance binder, naming the township as additional insured. As Dennis mentioned, in the prior years, they did go to the ZBA, and it was a pretty extensive process. It just doesn't need to be that extensive. The ZBA's seen them. We did it for a number of years. I don't think there were too many problems, so we really ought to just pull this in administratively and do it in a way that's a little simpler. And I think we can do a better job of coordinating too. We have technologies improved, so we'll map this all out. Once we're done, we'll share it with the Ally Challenge for folks, the police, the fire, other departments, of course, who would be interested, building, code enforcement. And we'll be able to review those applications rather quickly. We won't need to wait for a public hearing and to notice it for 15 days and all that. We'll be able to go through each one individually, or we could hang on to them and do them collectively. But the idea is to move them through rather quickly. We've already received a couple of applications. Folks who just mailed them in after hearing that there was the Ally Challenge. They just kind of wanted to get into the fold. So, you know, we're holding on to those and waiting until we make a decision. And hopefully that will happen this evening. I did establish a deadline for submittal. What we wanted to do is make sure we gave people about 60 days, which is about where we're at right now, by the way, for the event. But we gave them a deadline of September 4th, so that we had at least a week or so in advance to coordinate what we might have, coordinate with the folks from the Ally Challenge Police Department, who's of course going to be very involved, and just make sure that we haven't created or don't have circumstances that could be problematic, or that Warwick Hills has issues with any particular place parking, or whatever the case might be. So we built in some of those measures so that, you know, we've got a little bit extra time and we can just make sure that we do a good job. The other thing is that we'll, at the end of the day, what we'll do is we'll provide them with a permit. It'll be a written letter, basically, that allows for it and lists the conditions, and the conditions have been listed in the information that you guys have as well, and on the application materials. You'll see the second page that I provided has a list of criteria that they're going to need to meet. All pretty simple criteria, and then we gave them a sample of the drawing that we'd like to see. They can put it on paper and draw it by hand if they like, but with technologies, as I said, they can just pull up an aerial map and draw it on the aerial map and give it to us, and we'll use that. And as I said, we'll document that. We'll use our GIS folks, map all this out and distribute it to everybody who's interested or needs to know, emergency contacts and all that. We're having contact information from property owners as well as anybody who's running it, if it's not a property owner, maybe somebody who's leasing or renting. So I think we've covered all the bases, and I ran this through both Mr. Laddie as well as Chief Wiles before I submitted it. So you've got everything that we've put together. And I should point out, because I did hear there was some concern about the costs associated with this, and just for your information, of course you guys have every right to modify the fees as you like, but what I did was I did my best to provide you with full cost recovery. In other words, I wasn't going to propose to you that we subsidize this for anybody. That's your choice, not mine. So what I've given you is my analysis of what it would cost to do the review of each of the plans and put the stuff together, submit it to the folks at the Allied Challenge, coordinate that, put the maps together, work with police, work with fire, all the things we're going to need to do, and the enforcement even. You know, we're going to be out there having to do enforcement to the days of the event. So that's all part of the fee that you'll see. And some of them, you know, we may not spend, 4 hours on. But some of them we're going to spend 6 or 8, and others we're going to spend 2. And it's really hard to do something like this and try to charge an hourly rate because you got to go back after the fact. So what we did was took a look at this and did it, and identified it the same way we do special land use fees and other things. We looked at what the cost would be to provide the service and gave you a reasonable representation of what that is for your consideration.
I think, one of the things we want this to be a great event, and we want it to be well organized, which I'm sure the organizers of it are doing a fabulous job with, but we want to make sure our part of it's organized. And rather than just having a free-for-all of parking everywhere and anywhere, this process helps to ensure that won't happen.
Right.
And because it could get pretty harried with people allowing just anybody to park anywhere.
Absolutely.
And, so there will be a considerable amount of work involved in it, and like you say, even the enforcement, because once this thing gets rolling, hey, that looks like a great idea. Maybe I should allow a few people to park on my lawn.
Right.
And so what may look like a great idea to somebody may not have been thought all the way through.
Right.
And at least what we're helping to do is to help them to think through that process of, hey, are you parking over top of your septic tank?
Right.
And,
Sure.
hey, you got to have an exit in case somebody needs to get out of here. You
Right.
can't just stack them up so nobody can get out.
Mm-hmm.
So, and ensuring that people comply with that is another part to it. So,
Yeah.
I think it's a valuable service that we're providing and making sure that things are done in an organized fashion. So I appreciate you doing the work, and in terms of subsidizing, I'm not sure our taxpayers want to help subsidize the cost of, of this type of thing. So if you, put the pencil to the paper and figured out what it's going to take for our police to go through these plans and your staff, I think that's only right. And it's actually reduced from what our previous cost was. And
Well,
I also appreciate the fact that we're reducing, having to make people go through the
Right.
process of going before the ZBA to get something like this approved when we can do it administratively
right.
and speed up the process a little bit.
Well, and part of those costs before, if I might, had to include the cost for the public hearing notifications in the paper.
Right.
And there were several of those that had to happen.
Sure.
So those are pretty expensive, over $200. So,
Sure.
there's a lot of things going on here that are changed a little bit since
Yeah.
the time we did them before.
And cost of doing anything's gone up since then.
Yeah.
Mr. Massey?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, Director Lloyd, I have a question. Why not September the 10th versus starting on September the 13th?
Well, in talking with the folks, that the parking that we're talking about won't be necessary for the activities happening on I think the 10th and the 11th. Now, if you'd like, we can change that and make sure that we cover that. That's fine, but I did have some communication, so in order to be sure, we could open that time period up a little wider. There's other events going on, like a Pro-Am and stuff in advance.
Yes.
Some of them aren't even at this course, but they're happening during the time period that you're suggesting, the 10th. So some of these things aren't even at Warwick Hills, but the primary activities are going on 13th through the 16th.
Yes, I understand that part.
Yep.
But are you satisfied with September the 13th?
I am, after the communications that I've had, yes.
Okay, if you're okay,
Yeah.
I am okay.
Sure.
So they won't have any big crowds prior to that, probably, that they would
None,
require additional.
not that we've been made aware of, and I'll double check. If you'd like, just to be sure, just, you could open that up as a, if it needs to be adjusted, I'll follow up. It's worth doing. There's gonna be a lot of work that we're gonna be doing between now and the time the event happens, so having a little bit of flexibility there, if something was to occur, or they tell us, oh no, that's wrong information, there's gonna be a lot of people there, it'd be better than having to come back before you guys, if you give us, that option now.
Yeah.
You think we should give you that option?
Yeah,
Okay.
I mean, it's a good point, you might as well just open it up.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Lemina, do you have a hand up? Oh, okay, Ms. Lane?
My question to the board and to you, Mr. Lloyd, there are friends and family that live around Warwick. Now, if they have family come over for the event, where do we want to draw the line as far as a property owner having friends over and parking on their property versus people who want to go more professional and have a total parking? I mean, how are we going to set limits or guidelines to make that call?
Yeah, well, if they're parking on the grass or in the front yard, we'll make the call if they don't have a permit, because they wouldn't be able to.
Okay, but if they're parking on the driveway,
Oh, sure, sure.
Okay.
Any legal parking's still gonna be legal,
Okay.
except for areas that they may fence off or cone off or whatever. But sure, all that still doesn't change.
okay.
Mr. Mansour?
I know Mr.
Oh, okay, Mr. Guzak?
Yeah, I just had a question for Mr. Lehman. I know we talked about possibly a lower fee because we were trying to encourage the allied towns, so I don't know what your thoughts are on that. So you're okay with this fee then?
Yeah, so remember I said after the meeting I would get with Director Lloyd. We talked a little bit about the fee and how he arose, how he came to the idea of $300, and I'm pretty satisfied with what he said. A lot of the things, if you look at it, so somebody files an application that comes in, and he's got to review it, police department's got to review it. If there are some questions about ingress, egress, or some changes, we send it back, we have the people make changes, it comes back again, the two review it. And then I didn't think about the code enforcement aspect of it also, because we're gonna get calls from neighbors who say, they don't have a permit, and my neighbors have 25 cars parked in their front yard, and it's really irritating, there's garbage and they're driving in my yard. We're gonna end up sending police department or code enforcement out there, and we're gonna be looking for permits. So I think that the $300, I'm satisfied that Mark did his due diligence in coming up to $300. Now, it's a good point though, Treasurer Guzak, is that this board certainly has the ability to look at, you could make changes to it as far as concessions for nonprofits or something, if you were like, oh, it's a volleyball team and they're trying to raise it. But I would caution that it's just a slippery slope, because you have to figure out where you're gonna draw that line.
Yeah. Mr. Mansour?
So, yeah, I have a couple of questions. And I agree that we don't want to subsidize, and in fact, we talked about earlier the need for overtime for the police to handle crowd control on that, so I certainly wouldn't want to go lower on this. Do you have any idea, Director Lloyd, how many applications you expect?
Well, I took a look at some of what had happened in the past, and I don't think we're gonna get more than, 15 or 20.
Okay.
I mean, some of the properties are pretty big that will be being used. And around the facility, and what I'm talking about are, like residential properties or smaller properties. The number's just not that high. When I looked at it from before, I didn't see that many applications from before.
In going back to Clerk Lane's point, will we be able to advertise, or not necessarily advertise, but let people know, remind people what the current ordinance is, in order to maybe head off some of these things like parking maybe on our website or something like that, just so we can head off some of these potential problems?
We can, and
Right.
we should. We can do it in a couple of ways, none the least of which would be to, have it distributed through, the folks there at Warwick Hills, or, walk them to the doors ourselves if need be, But yeah, we can do that.
I have a couple more
That's a
if
good
I can.
suggestion, Mr. Mansour. Just
Yep.
on that point, Mr. Lehman, any thoughts on?
So I think we can do a real good job of doing a public service announcement on the
Yeah.
parking ordinance leading up to it, because it has been 9 years since we had the golf tournament here, and people have forgotten, and new people have moved in, and I think it's probably really smart of us just to head off things in the past, so instead of enforcement actions after the fact, that we're kind of trying to reach out to as many people as possible, social media, and then just a public service announcement, run it in the Grand Blanc View.
Yeah,
Couple-
good idea.
Yeah, go ahead.
A couple more. So I suppose this has been checked that this doesn't have to be in the form of a variance to an ordinance.
No, you have authority to grant that. These
But-
are your ordinances.
Right, but technically, does this have to be phrased in a way that this is a variance to the ordinance, as
Oh.
opposed to
It's a
here's
special
how we're
event.
going to do temporary parking?
Temporary special event is how it needs to be phrased, and I think
Okay.
that's what we've got.
So, okay,
Temporary parking.
all right, but it doesn't have to reference any existing ordinance or, okay.
No.
And then the other item that I had here was, So basically what we're doing is we're taking this activity of approving these parking requests off of the public sphere, so to speak, and bringing it into our planning or our administrative departments. So I think we need to be careful that we establish a certain criteria that is, that we can ensure that people, kind of know what that is, and that we execute it on a very transparent and consistent basis. If we're going to be, kind of taking that into our administrative.
So it doesn't, so for example, well, no, we're not gonna allow you, but we'll let your neighbor.
Exactly.
Oh.
right. Who needs that? No one needs
It's
that.
not subjective,
Right.
that it's all based on objective criteria.
Yeah, I don't know if we can do that, but it certainly, if we're taking it out of this sphere, then we need to have something like that.
Mr. Laddie, any thoughts?
Well, presumably, when you look at these things, you're gonna be looking at it's really gonna be a matter of space, right? And versus the number of proposed cars.
Right.
And the space is gonna dictate how many cars you could have. So you could have, theoretically, someone could come to you and say, I have room for one car, I'm making the application for one car, or it could be 100 cars, or whatever. So it's gonna be a mathematical formula. It's not gonna be necessarily based on location, it's not gonna be based, it may be based on ingress, egress, and things
Oh,
like that.
yeah, that's going to be critical.
So, it's interesting, I mean, maybe, you might want to provide in your file or something, some sort of reference to.
Rubric.
To how you're looking at these, applications, and how you're basically, it won't be a grid, but basically, if you could come up with some sort of, thumbnail specification.
Oh, sure, as far as
Just so if someone asks, you
dimensionally,
can
yeah.
say, well, here's what you needed, and here's what
Yes.
you didn't have, and things like that. I mean, I think that's a good point.
Yeah, I
So
would
do
hate
we
to
have
have
something like that, Mr. Lloyd, that we're using as far as a formula? Or how do we know whether somebody has enough space for
Well,
20 cars or 10 cars?
I think, I don't want this to come out wrong, but
Okay.
I have 30 years of experience with planning and laying parking lots and stuff out, and
Okay.
so from that standpoint, we're okay. What I will use as the standard, just so you know, is
Right.
the standard language in our ordinance now for the size of parking
Okay.
spaces.
That's
You know,
what I
and
thought.
drive aisles. We'll just use the standard criteria, because then we're not deviating, creating anything, that's different than our current ordinances as far as standards.
I would not want someone in, Warwick Hills to be, somehow denied something because the neighbor didn't want cars there, where the person across the street in Saginaw is fine. So I
Right.
just want
Sure.
to keep it consistent. Thank you.
Mr. Guzek?
Yeah, so it is legal for them to park on their front lawn once they have a permit, right?
Yes,
And their back lawn, any side, any property that
Right.
they own.
yes,
Well, if it meets our criteria.
sure, for access and maneuverability, yeah.
Ms. Lane?
I was inquiring again, I was here during the Buick Open, and I think the police department took all of Burning Tree and posted no parking on the streets to avoid that and to have access for safety measures. So I don't know if that's another thing that they're going to implement, is no parking in the street.
It is.
Okay.
And that'll be part of what we do when we coordinate further
Right.
with the folks through the Allied Challenge and Warwick Hills, of course.
So that might, even with the public service information that we put out there, it might be advantageous for us to put some
Yeah.
kind of, a few of the criteria that,
Right.
Sure.
that are, in
Okay.
terms of what kind of parking spaces are allowed,
And where we're going to cordon off, maybe.
yeah. So, yes. Mr. Atkins?
I've seen a few different numbers going around when this was first discussed, coming back to Grand Blanc, this tournament. But are there any estimates on what the attendance could be for this event?
I don't have that. There probably is. I just don't have
Mr. Lehman, have you?
I know it's real rough numbers,
it.
but
It's interesting because this is the first time event for us, and with it being the senior challenge. And when they initially started talking about it, they were thinking that maybe it was gonna be much on a lower scale, that there would be like 3,000 to 5,000, or, people who are coming out. And as we talked, we showed them, like at the Grand Blanc City food truck event in the high school parking lot, they get that many people. So they revised their estimate. The last I heard was that they would consider that maybe on the Friday, Saturday, events, that it could be upwards of 15,000 people. So it'd be interesting to see. I mean, they really the organizers are trying to make this one of the most successful, or the most successful tournament for the senior tour. And I think knowing that the history of the Buick Open and listening to the organizers as they talk to some of the golfers about, hey, are you going to come and golf in this tournament back up in Blanc Township? And they were like, absolutely. Are they still going to have hole number 17? Which I wasn't here then, but apparently that was a fun
A loud one.
hole to be at. So I think it's going to be a good turnout and a great event.
Well, and the other thing is they have a concert with Big and Rich on the one night, so they're expecting,
Included in the price of admission.
they could get considerable crowd just for that.
Yeah, there'd be a lot of them parking on Saginaw Street listening.
One other question then. So, assuming, you know, if they reach those numbers of 15,000, I don't know how much parking is at Warwick, but, and then assuming 15 or 20 residents apply for the permits, if we have not seen traffic like this for about 9 years now, are there old plans in place that we just bring back out of where everybody parks the overflow, or does Warwick handle that, or does every business up and down Saginaw kind of just open their lots, or are we just not even in that and people just work that out with?
I can't answer that question
Well,
because I don't know.
Mr. Lloyd, one of the things that they've been working on is a plan for the parking, so it isn't just, this is just kind of
This is a small
our
piece.
protection for people that decide they want to open their property, but they do have a plan in place. They've been working with the schools. Mr. Lehman, you can talk about it a little bit more.
The tournament organizers have held many meetings, and this is going back, I mean, we're probably like back a year now, practically. But they've held many meetings with us, with the city, with everybody, with law enforcement certainly, to try to figure out how we're going to work this. And I know that there is some plans left over. The experience from the Buick Open and this event will not be as popular as the Buick Open as far as attendance goes. So I think that they can handle it. Now, there's been some changes since then. Some areas that were parked have been built up, and so I mean, there's going to be a few challenges that didn't exist before. But I think that the organizers, they do other tournaments besides this one. The sports marketing company that does it, they do these all over the place, and so they're used to dealing with it all. It'll be the first time for this particular organizers to do it in Blanc Township. These are the same guys that were doing it in Arizona, who are doing it out, down south in North Carolina, and these guys have, tremendous amount of experience, and they come across as really trying to cross their T's and dot their I's. The multiple meetings with law enforcement, especially to talk about parking issues and how the busing's going to work and how do we get people from point A to point B away from the parking and then back to the venue. So I think that it's going to be well thought out and well planned.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, anything else for Mr. Lloyd? Okay, thank you very much. Thanks. Last operational issue is the board will consider a motion to adopt the Charter Township of Grand Blanc hiring policy, which covers all hiring for township employees, both union and non-represented. Mr. Limita?
So this is a result, if you recall, the board asked a couple of months ago about putting together a hiring policy. So we had a document that's adopted by the board that just provided some clarification because of some questions that had come up on a couple of different occasions. And Attorney Laddie was the first one who put the bones or the skeleton of this thing together. From there, after review, I sent it on to our Labor Council to see if they had any specific concerns about the policy in itself. It took them longer to review, and a couple of their biggest concerns were really to dive into what it said in the Charter Township Act about police and fire chiefs in particular, as well as assessors. And then they wanted to make sure that the Open Meetings Act was highlighted in here because it's as an important part of if the board is going to be doing the hiring for the police chief or fire chief, that all of the interviews take place in an open meeting that they occur here. So they wanted that specifically in the policy. The rest of it, I think, pretty much follows what we were already doing. There isn't we're not asking for a lot of changes in here. It's really just to formalize the policy. And the biggest questions about the Charter Township Act is very specific, like I said, about police chief, fire chief, and assessor, that the board has the power and authority to appoint those positions. It really comes down to they make policy decisions, and because those positions of police chief and fire chief specifically impact public policy, that it's important that those positions are done directly by the board. I can make the recommendation certainly and go through the screening process and do all those things, but the actual determination of who's going to move forward would be directly with the board. The other thing is with the department heads, for example, who have independent contracts, there's nothing wrong with the way we handle that currently. I can go through the screening process, work with HR, we take all the candidates, we go through the screening process, we do all the initial interviews, and we really come to you when we're ready to propose a candidate and to negotiate a contract and look for the parameters that the board will allow us within that range to offer any individual candidate. When it comes to the fire personnel or the police personnel, officers and firefighters, there wasn't as much concern about the Charter Township Act there. They really believe that it's the policymakers. The difference is whether they have the ability to create policy. And so the police officers and fire chief, we can move forward. It follows the same procedure that we're doing now. If this board has authorized 43 sworn officer positions, for example, and we have the ability to move it forward, we'll handle it just like we have been, where we come to the board and ask that ask for permission that we're moving forward with filling those positions as budgeted, and then the person will be then be able to be vetted and the background check done, and then they will be have the badge pinning ceremony and the swearing in at a later date. But it gives us the ability to offer that contingent offer of employment without exposing the candidate.
So yeah, that, I can think that kind of spurred us on to clarifying this is when we are hiring police or fire, and that we want to give you the authority to move forward, but yet we don't want to have their name out in public, and in the event that maybe something doesn't clear on their background or what have you, and we're able to move on to the next candidate without it becoming a public event. So, but my contention is that we've hired you to run the day-to-day operations, and you need to assemble a team that you can work with and that is going to make our township successful, and a policy like this that gives you that authority to hire is what we need. So I'm good with it. Mr. Mansour?
Couple questions?
Sure.
So in the first section here, under section 2, screen, interview, and fill all vacant budgeted positions, what I think I heard you say was a little bit different than that. I thought I heard you say that for budgeted positions, you would do the screening, the interviewing, and then present your recommendations here.
If it's a union position, we'll move forward,
Okay.
Because we follow the parameters of union collective bargaining agreements, and I have the ability to move forward. But if it comes to something like it's a vacant DPW director's position or something, I'm going to come to you because we have to negotiate those independent contracts, so it's different. I have to come to you and ask, hey, I've got a candidate selected and here's his background. You'll share that information with you. But as far as doing the actual interviewing, selection, all that would be handled by the superintendent.
So that's where I was a little bit, because it says screen, interview, and fill, which I would interpret that as meaning, sign off, present them the offer, and bring them on board.
And that's where the subject to certain limitations, so if it has to do specifically with police and fire or independent contracts.
Okay, so is that spelled, that was just my second question, what does certain limitations mean? Is that spelled out somewhere?
I'm sorry, in section 3, you've got subject to the provisions of 4, 5, 6, and 7, and that basically carves out what I
Okay.
call the key personnel.
Okay,
So it's, first of all inclusive, and then it's narrowed down farther on in the document. But
then, next question I had here was, what is there, maybe I'm just ignorant on this, but what's the deal with assessors? Why is there a special thing that there's a limit and that's
So the assessor is interesting, but because the assessor signs your tax roll, and in the Charter Township, in township government, the Charter Township, your elected supervisor is always your chief assessing officer, and your assessor reports directly to your supervisor as the chief assessing officer. It's a throwback to when the supervisors would get elected, and then they would, if they weren't trained in assessing, they would start taking the classes, and it was much easier to go through what you needed to do to get certified as an assessor back then. Well, it's just an anomaly in the law that still remains out there. So that's why that's carved out within the Charter Township Act, that they specifically isolate the assessors. It has to do with that connection between the elected supervisor as the chief assessing officer and your assessor of record, who has to be certified at the level required based upon your tax roll.
And this says not exceeding 2. Is that also in the charter?
That is language directly out of the Charter Township Act.
Huh, okay. The final question that I had here was, I don't see anywhere in this hiring policy anything relative to equal employment and those kind of standard things that we always hear about. Is it related, referenced? I mean, how does it tie into this?
Mr. Laddie?
It could be in there, it just.
It could, yeah, but we're, as a municipal entity, we're bound by any applicable federal or state statute. And so anything that we would ever engage in terms of our hiring policy or employment policies, we're naturally bound by any applicable federal or state law.
So that doesn't have to be mentioned here, it just goes without saying, right? Okay.
Mr. Atkins?
Couple questions I have. So in Section 5, Police Chief and Fire Chief, there's a lot of mention to the role of the superintendent throughout this in terms of screening prior. I'm guessing that would be to, let's just say you had 10 people apply for the chief of police role, if that was ever open. Is that position on its own, all those candidates then would come before this board, or are you covered to do, how does that work for those 2 positions? Would you screen ahead of time, or would we interview every candidate?
No, we would still go through the screening process. There's a lot of different ways that it's done, and with this policy, the township superintendent shall present to the township board candidates for police chief and fire chief. If you think about the process, there's a lot of ways we can do it. If I won't go through a process and I start that initial screening and I bring it down to, we have 40 applicants, we interview the top 10, we do second interviews on 5, and we think we've got it down to 2. I think it would be more likely that I would present the top 2 candidates for interviews. You'll be all given a list of screened questions from the attorneys that are safe questions that we're guaranteed not to get us into trouble, and you would have the opportunity to meet those individual candidates, the top 2 candidates. If you found neither one of them to your liking, then you could ask, well, can we interview additional candidates? Then I could always bring more candidates out, but I think it's more about the selection and bringing it down so that you're not interviewing 40 candidates for the position.
But I think also in that light too, we want a police chief or fire chief in this case to be people that you can work well with, and so that's why I would see the advantage of you narrowing it down to a couple of candidates that you feel that could fit with your team. And Mr. Lehman has done a great job of leadership building here and is continually working on that, and I think we want to continue on that trend.
I think one of the things that's important for the board to know is when we start to do our interviews and we put panels together, so it's not just me interviewing. I try to take out that personal bias in case I'm looking at somebody differently. We always try to have at least 3 people on a panel interview. We may bring in the police chief, for example. We may bring in the finance director. The human resource generalist is always in on the interviews. And much like we even do over at the police department, we start with the candidates. We'll have a group of officers who do the initial screening. I come in on the second interviews and then subsequent third if we need. As we're going through the screening process, we try to get a variety of people. If you're looking at, say, a fire chief's position, for example, it would behoove us to ask a fire chief from a neighboring district to sit on our panel. When we were interviewing planning director candidates, we asked one of our planning commissioners, Ed Brown, to sit in on the panel to look at the planners. We always try to bring that panel interview together, and then we compare notes after the interviews to see if there was something we missed, if anybody had a feel, and that's how I've done it since I got here, is to establish a panel for each position and just bring in some outside, somebody who's got a different perspective during the process.
Mr. Chair,
Yes, Mr. Massey?
I have a question for the superintendent. As I read section 5, I have a concern, and I think the chair echoed that concern earlier, but I just want you to expound on it a little. When we said bring them in an open meeting, bring them to an open meeting, will the candidate personally be here in person?
Yes.
So at that time, we will be allowed to ask the candidate questions.
Yes.
Is that, boy, I'm just thinking.
Well, one of the things we do, Mr. Massey, in that event is we have our attorney go through some questions that are pre-screened so that we don't, I mean, there's certain things you can't ask a candidate.
Well,
right?
and what we also have done in the past is we'll set up a list of questions that all the candidates will get. And so they'll have the opportunity to no one will have an advantage over another candidate. But yeah, we have done that in the past where we'll bring in our candidates, we'll bring them in separately.
Okay.
And you'll be able to ask them questions. You can, I mean, again, we've got topics that are off limits and then topics that you're gonna wanna explore.
Okay.
But yeah, it's gonna happen in open session.
And we did that with the hiring of Mr. Limita.
And certainly, if we were going through it and somebody's touching on a absolutely do not ask question, myself or Mr. Laddie will certainly stop that questioning from moving forward to protect us.
I guess my concern is, let me ask the question a different way. Will the candidates be asked prior to coming before the board, whether they are willing to go before the board in a public hearing?
Absolutely. They can remain confidential, and at the beginning phase of the process, candidates have the right to remain confidential. When we get down to the short list and we're going to do interviews and it has to take place in public, then they have to, that's the time they're going to have to decide to either waive their confidentiality or they're going to drop out of the running. At some point, everybody, even if they've asked for confidentiality, you have to expose them at the end. So that's just, it's a nuance of government, but it's at open meetings. We want people to know, and especially, that is one of the things that the Labor Council really drove home, is that all interviews for the position of Township Police Chief or Fire Chief shall take place during an open meeting of the Township Board. So we can go through some screening processes, but when it comes time to actually do, we're gonna do full-blown interviews for the board to make a decision on, yes, I'm gonna make a motion to hire this candidate. Those will take place in the auditorium in an open meeting.
Thank you.
that
I have
true?
just one comment on that, and this is a pet peeve of mine. The only exception to this requirement as far as municipal entities are concerned in the state of Michigan are higher education universities. For some reason, there is a carve-out where they get to operate almost in
Really?
complete secrecy up until the end, and I don't know why that is. I mean, they may have excellent lobbyists, but
Just say better lobby.
yeah, but we don't have that luxury. No, I think that's a disservice, frankly, to your residents. I think at a point in time when Mr. Lehman brings to you a choice of candidates, it's cards on the table time, I think.
The reason I raised the issue because sometimes candidates do not want the current employer to know that they are looking outside of the organization.
Eventually they gotta declare that.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Lane?
My other concern would be, there's mention in section 2, screen, interview, and fill all vacant budgeted positions. The budget is supposed to be, as I understand it, a guideline, and maybe we'd have to pay more attention to which positions are vacant and which ones we want to fill. In case we disagree with some positions being filled. So I'm just pointing that out, that's something that in the budgeting process, which we've as a group only been through a couple of times, we have to pay special attention to that particular section, because if all of a sudden someone is hired and we're going, wait a minute, so I'm just bringing that up, that because in the past, not all vacant positions were filled. It was a guide, and
Well, if we're budgeting for it, we must want it, but Mr. Levina?
Through the budget process, every single position that's proposed is in the budget. When you guys are presented it, you'll see all of the current employees. You get a list of all the current employees and where we're at with those.
Right.
Whether there's any proposed vacancies, it's in the narrative and it's in the actual budget, including part-time money, like Trustee Mansford brought up earlier, the contingent employee for GIS IT, whether we have any part-time positions proposed. So when you get through your budget documents, it's in there. It's here's our complete head count for 2018. Here's our proposal for 2019 by department, what's proposed. And really that's the time to either, for board discussion, to say, no, we don't want to move it, or we want less people, or can we downsize, can we get rid of some? You know, if we budgeted the positions and we're moving forward, and a lot of this had to do with part-time positions, because the prior policy to this allowed department heads to hire a part-time employee without my approval or even running it through HR. As long as they had money budgeted for a part-time employee, they could move forward. That policy was in place when I got here, and I have a slight issue with it because it's just turning people loose to hire. Well, if we've allocated $36,000, I can hire part-timers and use $36,000, and I don't have to run it through human resources, and I don't have to have superintendent's approval. So this is really a change to the existing policy, which will supersede what we had prior to this.
Which actually tightens it up.
Well, those two positions didn't exist when we created that policy. And so it was the township board having to consider whether to hire a part-time person or not. And they, given the limited resources, they said no. So I agree, this is a much improved process by virtue of the occupation of both those offices.
Exactly. Okay, any other comment on that policy? Mr. Guzak?
Yeah, I just had a comment, because I know when we went through the budget, I thought we were told that this was the preliminary budget, and we would have the final say. And so I might have been more restrictive, because there might have been positions in there. I'll have to go back and look, because we've had extra positions in some departments that we've eliminated, and now if you're putting them all back in, there was no need before. So I guess I'll have to look at it, because I was under the assumption that it could be brought back to the board at that point in time, and then it could be denied. And of course, we did that a lot because we didn't have the funds, even though it was in the budget. We wanted to spend those monies for something else.
I'm not sure what you're referring to as far as positions put back in. I mean, there's been vacancies that we haven't filled that were like in the DPW, that were in the police department that we haven't filled, and it was because even though we had budgeted with the anticipation to fill those, the need didn't arise, so we didn't fill it. We're not looking to fill positions to fill positions. We do it based upon need, and it's more, again, the budget isn't an authority to spend, but the head count of, do you agree with this number of positions in moving forward? If you don't agree, the time to discuss it is during that budget sessions. And we're going to try something different this year. I'm probably jumping the gun before we get ready, but I talked to you guys about the preliminary budgets going out to the department heads now, and then we'll start working on that so that we have it in time for the September 1st to give you guys the completed proposed budget. But we're going to try to propose 3 different evening meetings, like maybe we'll run them from 4 to 7 or something, and just have all department heads here on 3 different nights, so that it can be a drop-in for any board member can come in and get any questions asked about the budget. Because we just think it takes some of the pressure off of trying to squeeze it into board meetings and say, oh, let's talk about the budget now and shift gears. We're going to try to open it up and just have everybody here and make them available so that any board member has that ability to meet with them, and maybe we can have much more dialogue on it. But that's a good time to ask about the questions. I mean, if you've got questions about staffing, you can ask me that anytime as far as our head count goes and how we've compared over the years, because we haven't created, we really haven't created a lot of positions here.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to go through couple things with you.
Mr. Guzak, Mr. Mansour?
The other Mr. Guzak. I have a question for Superintendent Lemata. Could you maybe sketch out for us just kind of the intended budget process for this year? I mean, you mentioned department heads get at a certain point, and obviously you're going to get it back and do some churns, and then there's going to be a window. You've already started talking about it. We have proposing a few meetings, and then maybe an idea of an initial approval, and then kind of a final approval, just so we can kind of see ahead of us what our time frame looks at in case we feel we need to dig into some areas. At least we can work within a window.
I'll actually send out the letter so that you guys can see what goes out to the department heads. That will probably be the easiest thing. It does include the timeline so that you can see, of course I can't connect right now because I never pick up in here. But I already have the timeline put together for this year, and it comes out, so they receive their information now. They get the last 3 years worth of data, plus they have to go through and they have to let us know if they're projecting any changes to the remainder of the year. We make a project out for 2018. So all those will come back to me by the beginning of August. So from the beginning of August, I'll start holding my individual department meetings where I sit down and we walk line by line with each department head and discuss the need. They've also provided their narrative, their initial narrative to me by then that talks about, their narrative is there to support any changes to the budget specifically, but then just to walk us through the importance of why they're allocating the monies that they're allocating or why they're making requests. If there's any kind of new request, because since I've been here, we've operated on a maintenance budget. We're trying to maintain what we have without proposing a lot of new programs. Obviously for financial reasons. We're still in a recovery phase, and even though we've had growth for the last 5 years, I approach it every year that it's a maintenance budget. We're not looking for you to expound on new programs or add new people or do anything unless there's a very good reason for it. And so that narrative goes through that. I sit down individually, we get through that sometime over the next few weeks, and then we start to put it together. I may go through the initial one and then call them back in and have them cut more out. Because we'll get it. So by the time I'm prepared to submit for the beginning of September to the board, I'll have had a couple of sessions with department heads. We'll have reviewed the last 3 years, their projections for 2018, and then their projections for 2019. I'll have tweaked it. When you guys get it at the beginning of September, you'll see what the anticipated, you'll see what the original 2018 budget was, the anticipated 2018 budget finalized if they've made any changes. You'll see their request for 2019, and then you'll see my request for 2019 that may or may not vary on certain things, but it's by line item, and you can go right down the line item. And then, that's what I said, for that next month, we'll schedule those 3 meetings. And if there's a better time than 4 to 7, let me know, or if we don't need 3 of them, or if we need 5 of them, it doesn't matter, we want to be here. But we wanted to try to make it as accessible as possible so that board members could come in and meet as a whole or as an individual with just, they have questions about one particular budget, and they just want to talk about planning and zoning or building, or they want to talk about police department. Police department raises a lot of questions because it's our biggest cost center. It takes up about 60% of our general fund budget. So we want to make sure that we've given you guys more than ample opportunity, and if we need to hold more, we will. But by the time we start to bring it forward in October's meetings, then we would hope that we've gotten most of the questions answered, and if we need to have department heads come for a specific meeting to address any lingering concerns about the budget or to make some changes after you guys have had a month to review it, we'll do whatever it takes. We have until December 15th. You have to approve the budget by December 15th. So we can hold special meetings if we needed to. Usually we can cover it. We'll be prepared to approve it in November, then we'll approve it in November, but we have to have it done no later than December 15th.
Mr. Massey?
Chair, I'd like to know, how did we get on the budget discussion?
Because of the hiring.
The hiring policy, that fitting it in, how many, Mr. Guzak brought up the concern as far as filling positions and vacancies, what have you. So I think we'll get that cleared up during the budgeting process, if there's any positions that are vacant that we plan to fill this next year.
I understand that, but that's budget time.
Right.
It's not, this is not a time to talk about budget issues. We had an opportunity when the budget was put before us to talk about the issues of the budget that we're talking about now. That's my understanding.
Well, I understand your concern, and we'll make sure we stay on topic, but I think the concern was making sure that if we're going to look at positions that aren't filled, that we make sure we look at that during the budgeting process. So we'll make sure we pay attention to that. Okay, anything else on that policy? And going back to our agenda for this evening, I think we had some written reports that hopefully all of you read. Mr. Laddie or Mr. Limita?
I don't have anything for you tonight.
Okay. I think we're,
I'd like to make a motion to adjourn.
Support.
okay, there's support. Any discussion? All those in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed?